Welcome back to the Barbell Medicine Podcast, where we bring modern medicine to strength conditioning and strength and conditioning to modern medicine. On today's episode, we have a very special guest, Dr. Franco Impellizzeri. He is redefining how we think about training and sports and performance. I came across some papers starting a few years ago and have been addicted to them. And so now you guys get to learn from one of the best in exercise physiology, statistical methodology, and everything having to do with sports science, specifically around training load and injury prevention. He's helped teams and athletes move from guesswork to a scientific approach. It's an honor to welcome Dr. Franco Impellizzeri to the Barbell Medicine Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. How's it going?
Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, it's going well, and I'm not that good as you're saying, but I really appreciate the take.
Well, there you go. Yeah. So look, if and when the next time I come to Australia and whatever, maybe you give me a more grandiose introduction than I deserve. That's the idea here.
Yeah, I can prepare a pizza also.
There you go. Can you tell our audience who may not be familiar with you a little bit about what you do? What's your day to day? I know you're at university right now, but is it mostly research? Are you teaching? Are you doing a little bit of both? What's going on over there?
Yeah, now I joined the University of Technology Sydney in 2018. Before that, I worked in private sector actually, so I'm a rookie in the academic system. So I worked 10 years in a private research center. Basically, there was a company sponsoring athletes and teams, and I worked for them. The idea was simply that since they were giving money to teams and athletes, they wanted someone taking care of their investment. This is how I approach sport at the beginning. And after I transitioned for 10 years in orthopedics, just to have a new experience and open a bit my mind, and actually was really helpful. And in the meantime, I also train athletes, teams, and other stuff. And now I'm taking care of research methods. I'm teaching research methods here at the university, and I'm focusing on various areas, like training load is one of my main area historically, basically. And I'm teaching sport epidemiology and all this kind of stuff, all boring things.
No, I was going to say, do you ever get, if somebody sees you and they're like recognize you or whatever, or maybe from your introduction, they say, oh, you're the training load guy. And you're like, I also am interested in other things. Does that ever happen to you?
Yeah, it happens a lot. I started my career writing papers on training load, and also recently to try to clarify some concepts about training load. I'm more popular for training load, but recently I had some back and forth with some researchers in journal for the so-called acute chronic workload ratio, which is a ratio that is supposed to help preventing injuries, and our reanalysis of Nordic hamstring exercises. I'm approaching the area more from a meta-research perspective, which meta-research is basically the study of research methods. And the main reason is just because we want to give information to coaches that are helpful, and I don't want to be the one creating too much confusion. So sometimes I a bit question at least the way some results are communicated to coaches, and that can create more problem than solutions, let's say.
Yeah, I like that. It also makes science communication, something we try to do here at Barbell Medicine, a lot easier when there's no need to hire a specialist to interpret the paper because it's written in such a way, or the methodology is done in such a way where you're like, I feel like I need to have a PhD in this specific thing to understand what was done here. I want to know what you found when you did the research, but I'm not smart enough. So it is helpful, I think, to have some steeping there. We start each one of these podcasts with guest speakers, with two questions. I think they're interesting. We'll see how you take them. The first question is, what is your fitness mode of choice? If you were your current exercise routine, I always want to know what people do for their own sort of fitness, just to see.
I'm a strength training addicted. I have the gym here in my garage. I had to. I was training a lot, basically every day for years. I changed a bit my habits after the COVID for some reasons, and because the volume of work became quite a lot. So I'm not training a lot now, but when I can, I resistance training is my is my preferred form of training. I'm very traditional, and people are told me, "You're training every day. You know, it's not correct good because you have to record." I say, I don't care. I mean, I just like it and do. I'm doing what I like it. So
Yeah, yeah. And I'm the training load guy. If anyone knows if I'm doing too much, having too much training load, it's me.
yeah, I also come from combat sports, which is a very interesting area because the way you approach training load is, in my opinion, is completely different compared to other disciplines because you want to train a lot, you want to suffer, and this is not only related to the fitness improvements you can have, but it's also psychological thing. So you want to feel strong. You want to not have regret before competing, which
Yeah.
is the days before a competition, a combat, is where everything comes out. You start to see to think, yeah, maybe I didn't do enough, all these kind of things. So from that perspective, sometimes pushing a bit the boundaries of training is useful, even if there are some risks. But on the other side, the risk is to go to compete, to fight without the confidence.
Yep.
So you need to balance a bit the two things, and that's why sometimes I'm a bit critical about some forms of training load management that don't consider these other aspects.
Yeah, it's not just fitness. It's also like, do you feel like, well, I didn't leave any stone unturned. I feel as prepared as I can possibly be. I did everything. And yeah, certainly different personality types would like lead you to different management strategies there. That's interesting. We're going to talk about it. And then the second question before we dive in to start talking about training load is, what are you reading right now, or do you have a book recommendation for our audience? Mostly, it's a mix of lay and professional folks, health and fitness professional folks. So, if you had a book recommendation, I always like to ask our guests what they recommend.
Well, I'm a bit biased here because, well, I have two kinds of literature that normally I read. One is about research methods and specifically epidemiology. And the reason is simple that because there are not a lot of areas in which you can find books or literature specific on methods of research. And epidemiology is one of these. Some people in sports science criticize me a bit because I rely too much on epidemiology. But in the end of the day, when you want to measure the relation between the exposure and the disease, if the exposure is training and instead of the disease I have performance or injuries or whatever, it is exactly the same. So I find that kind of literature very useful, and I normally suggest this literature to everyone who wants to know more about the research. So modern epidemiology of Green and Rothman, Lash, these big names in epidemiology, is something I recommend. And I have another bias, which is I read the books of Vern Gambetta. I know him. I really value Vern as a professional. It doesn't mean that I necessarily agree with everything he says, but when he's here in Sydney, we often meet, and I have a very nice conversation. And besides, I don't know if we have time to go into this, but I like to surround myself with people that challenge me intellectually. I don't like to have people that just tell me how good I am, because at some point you may think it to be much better what you really are. So I think it's important to have this kind of, yeah, you know. So I like a lot how Vern write things and the pragmatic approach. So yeah.
Well, I will then. I'm just going to throw my script away then. It was very complimentary, and now we're just going to be antagonistic and just see what. I'm just kidding. See how this goes. So let's start with the first of today's topic. It's going to be training load, and for a long time, the term training load has been used to characterize the amount and the nature of, in this case, exercise or potentially sports practice or sports competition that an individual performs. However, your work further refined that understanding to kind of come up with two subcategories: external and internal training loads. The first time I ever saw that in the research. Now, for listeners who may not be familiar with these terms, how do you define external and internal training loads?
Yeah, we came out with this classification 20 years ago. Just for full transparency, it's not something I invented. That it was a classification that was used in the coaching world in some niche areas of coaching world, and I just transformed this in something that could be communicated from a scientific perspective. And when I read the first time, I found it quite reasonable. I'm a huge fan of logic, so I found it very logic. And so basically, when you train someone, you use something, and something can be a barbell, can be sprinting or whatever, in order to obtain an internal response. So this is why you use these forms of these training strategies. The point is that the how people adapt to these training stimuli is based on the internal response, how your body is reacting to that load. So we can lift 100 kilograms both, but this can have different effect because for me maybe too much, and for you can be just the warm up. So it's in the end of the day, the reason why we manipulate these exercises that I define external load is to induce an internal physiological response. That's why we call internal load. So external is something you administer from outside, like a training plan. When you write down a training plan, you have to write down something, and the internal load is the internal response.
Yeah, no, that's a great description. And when we do our programming lectures, we use these terms. And to your point, when people first hear of these, they have that sort of logical understanding, like, oh, this seems, to use your word, reasonable. And yeah, you can spend some time trying to pick it apart, and one of the first maybe barriers for someone adopting that terminology or even considering it useful is like, okay, well, great. Well, how are we going to measure the external load, and how are we going to measure the internal load? So, like, when it comes to external load, if we think this is like the nuts and bolts of a training program, are we just talking about things like intensity, volume, stuff like that, or are there other ways that you have found to measure external load that you feel like have a maybe either greater transference to the outcome of interest, or otherwise you feel like they're more important?
Yeah, that's actually not an easy question, and so the answer is quite complicated. But I try to keep it simple. So first of all, I normally start with a simple concept. The monitoring training load makes sense if you start with a training plan. There's no such a thing like monitoring something just for monitoring. So normally what I try to explain is that what to measure and how to monitor depends on your training plan. So if you decide to use some training strategies, I suppose you have an idea. You have an idea about the progression you want to follow, all these kind of things. So what you should follow and monitor is if what you have planned is actually happening. So if you are actually doing what you were supposed to do. This is the first point of monitor, which means there's no such a thing like the best metric, the best measure for training load. If you, for example, if you have decided in your training to introduce, I don't know, 10 sprints for some reasons, what you want to know if they have completed these 10 sprints and the intensity of these sprints, because you have in your mind an idea. So the idea is to reach some high speeds so that this can have a neuromuscular effect, all these kind of things. So I decide what to measure based on my program. And the common question of people is, what's the best metric? There's no best metric, because it depends on if you have designed you're training resistance training based on time under tension, you will probably monitor the time under tension because that was your goal. So it's really everything starts from the plan and from the coach. It doesn't start from, let's say, the sports science department. The sports science department give you the instruments to monitor what you really care and the variables that you have used to design your program.
Yeah.
I hope I answered to your question.
No, you did. It actually leads me to kind of my second thought and another like aha moment, although this one happened more recently. Uh, it probably, and I imagine this is similar to you when you first kind of came across this subgroup who was using the term external and internal load, and you were like, I dig that. I like that. You had mentioned this phrase, mediating mechanism. The idea that if you're trying to come up with a training measure, it's most useful if it captures the mediating mechanism, where mediating mechanism refers to what's causing the potential change in this case, like a fitness adaptation or performance change, right? So for strength training, if we were trying to come up with a mediating mechanism, you could come up with a worse metric than like number of hard sets or average intensity. I mean, we could argue about which one's most useful, which one correlates best, but there
Yeah.
are specific values that you would want to track based on your predicted mediating mechanism, which may or may not be correct.
Yeah, that's actually, that's a very important point. The problem is that most of the time you can't measure these mediating mechanisms. And what you do, because let's say when you're using a barbell, you want to induce some neuromuscular, a specific neuromuscular stimulus, but you can't measure the neuromuscular stimulus. That's why sometimes you measure external load, not because you don't want to measure internal load, because you can't do that, because you don't have any, you cannot place electrodes to measure the electrical activity of the muscle, these kind of things. That's not something you can do on a routine base. So normally what you do, you use a measure of external load as a proxy of these internal responses. So the problem is that the proxies may be not that accurate. But it's also true that in real world we don't have all these instruments at the moment. So, for example, now people are using velocity-based training a lot and so the idea behind is to provide a very specific neuromuscular stimulus, and so they are using velocity as a proxy of a mediator. The literature that you can read is to understand whether velocity is actually a good proxy of this mediator, and this is how you should read the literature, not just jumping here and there, because there's too much literature around. Unfortunately, most is not really reliable, but is plenty. So you needed to have a sort of roadmap when you want to enter in this area of evidence-based practice. So there's no, I can't answer telling you what's the best metric, because you can also use just the proportion of maximum RM, and the assumption is that if I'm working 90%, this is correspond to a neuromuscular stimulus that is higher enough to achieve what I want to achieve. And so in that case, it's okay. I don't complain. Now with the new wearables, all these technologies, when you're using these raw measures, it seems you're not doing your job. No, you're perfectly doing your job. Maybe even more appropriate than other measure. So it's more, again, why you're doing something. So think about why you're writing in your piece of paper on your computer that specific program. So if you have 3 sets for something, why are you doing that? Because there should be a reason. So
We hope.
yeah. Well, this is actually how I start I realized my biases. So one day I was writing a training program for some athletes, and I used a lot deadlifts. And if you ask me at that time, I could tell you a lot of reasons why these deadlifts were beneficial. But at some point, I started to think, well, I I always use deadlifts, even
Right.
before starting, to understand science, all these kind of things. So I was thinking why I'm using deadlift, and realized that I simply like deadlifts. So I said maybe this is why I'm using. But the point is that there are other reasons why I'm using deadlift. But my point is that sometimes we do things because we are used to do that, and we
Hmm.
try to create to generate an hypothesis of why we are doing that more as a reaction to cognitive dissonance. So over time, I just embrace my biases. So I know that as I told you, I'm using a lot of resistance training, even in contexts where people were not used to do that, and that was criticized. I said, I don't care. I think is important. I grow up this way, and I'm just doing that. I didn't try to say this is evidence based. I said no, that's my experience, and
Yeah.
I don't see evidence that convinced me to change what I have done until now based on my experience. That's how I use literature and research.
Yeah, I would like to draw attention to the listeners at home that that is probably the best way to kind of wrestle with our own bias. We all have our own biases for sure, and but also wanting to kind of abide by evidence-based practices. Like you can choose to do something that has minimal evidence to support picking that particular thing, and instead of backfilling, reverse engineering a reason to try to make yourself feel good and warm and fuzzy, you can say, I just like it, but I haven't also been convinced that it's the wrong choice based on the existing evidence, and that's totally reasonable. For example, if somebody instead of deadlifts was like, "Well, I prefer Romanian deadlifts as a specific variation," you'd be like, "Fine." Not is not
Yeah.
only because you didn't arrive at deadlifts by eliminating all of these other choices based on some you know canon of evidence that exists, because it doesn't. It's more you're just like, I like deadlifting from the floor. You want to deadlift from the top? That's fine. Like whatever, it's all the same.
Yeah, again, I think sometimes people miss a bit the point of training, especially now with this fixation for evidence-based practice. And I'm saying fixation because it's wrong. It's because um, it's abused, this term and this idea of using evidence-based methods. It's very complicated to use evidence-based methods, and most of the time people don't even know well what is evidence-based practice. They think it's just because there is an abstract on PubMed and so on.
There's a PubMed. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's actually not how it works. I would say now it's even more complicated than in the past. But the point is that we need to be realistic and pragmatic when we do things, and we need to approach coaching from a bigger perspective. And I find very disappointing, especially from some coaches, that they always insist about holistic view. Now there is also this nice term, dynamic system, complex system, all these kind of things. And on the other side, they tend to simplify too much. They don't see the big picture. Because I tell you why I think that lifting is good, especially when I start to work in sports where the athletes don't have a lot of experience in resistance training. What and you know very well, with deadlift, you can increase the load relatively soon. So you can lift more than 100 kilograms in a relatively short time. And imagine someone that has no experience with weight, so they don't know that 100 kilograms is not a lot.
Yeah. Right.
But
Yeah.
when they see these 100 kilo and they start to lift these 100 kilograms, they start to feel strong, more confident, and these kind of things. So deadlift for me is more a way to give athletes some confidence more than training their back. And once they start to approach resistance training, they see the loads is more than 1 kilograms. They are more engaged in this new form of training, especially if they are not used. So I see these training strategies from another perspective, not simply just because I'm training a specific muscle, but it is more as a strategy to reach something else that is not purely physical.
Yeah, hard to make that tangible. Also, you're like, oh, you're more confident now. How do we measure that? There's some questionnaires, obviously, but yeah, it's interesting perspective. Um, so if the external training load that you're measuring is by some sort of variable that you feel like is likely to contribute to the adaptation of interest or adaptations of interest, how would you go about measuring internal training load? My familiarity with measuring internal training load, since it's really hard to get inside the body and like measure the specific thing, you use proxies, something like RPE, session RPE, heart rate. It all is telling you basically how the body is experiencing whatever the external training load is and allows you to kind of rate, well, is this harder or easier, more or less stressful? Does that seem accurate to you, or do you feel like I'm oversimplifying?
No, it's not an oversimplification. It is the only thing we can do, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes you measure perception because it's easy to do. You don't have other instruments, and is a proxy of intensity, basically. People told me, yeah, but the RP also include other components like psychological components and so on. Yes, that's true, but do you have something else, something working better that exclude the psychological components? Beside the psychological components influence a lot of other measures, also external. So if you measure one RM one day, you are for some reason very well motivated, maybe you are even a bit hungry that day for some reason, you can push harder, and another day you push less. So there's no measure that is not influenced, especially in sport where it's all performance based and performance is very influenced by motivation. There's always some sort of other influences. The important is to understand and knowledge the limitations of the measure that you're using. So if you're using RP, you know that this can be influenced by other factors, but the same is heart rate, the same is, even if you use the EMG, this can be influenced simply by where you are placing the electrodes. So there's not such a measure like a perfect or gold standard measure. There are a lot of measures. So the way I think people may interpret training load monitoring is like having pieces of information that in isolation they don't tell you a lot, but when they are combined, they can give you a better picture of the situation. So you may want to use RP, heart rate, you use external load, you combine all this information and you try to see if there is a trend in some direction. And I use often the term trend because trends are what we are observing. When you measure something specifically in that session with that athlete, it's just a picture of that moment. Mm-hmm. And so let's say that day the perception is higher. It may be because the athlete is tired, because the day before they did something, they didn't sleep well. The day after, the same exercise can induce a slightly different kind of response. And that's why I'm saying internal response is actually important, because in the end of the day, it's the internal response that determines how you are improving, or the adaptations, all these kind of things. So the way, and we wrote that several times, you understand how to monitor athletes is by measuring all these responses. So you measure the stimulus, you try to measure the response. Heart rate variability normally is a response. So you measure after the training to see how you're responding. And the assumption is that the magnitude of the response is in some ways related to the magnitude of the stimulus. So, and you try to balance this. And this is a way to understand the training tolerance of the athletes. And normally, as I told you, I'm a coach, so I used to train people at the limits. If you have to go to an Olympic Games, you don't want to go there as a tourist. You go there to compete and have some chance of either winning or having a good placement. So, and the only way to do that is to push the athletes. You cannot, I cannot cut half the volume of training because I reduce the injury risk, all this kind of thing. Yeah, that's true. But there is actually a simple reason why you reduce the risk, because you are training less. So yeah, the time at risk is lower. But this also means compromising the possibility to excel in the performance. So that's normal. And this is why you try to understand the tolerance and to work closer to the tolerance, at least in high performance sport.
Yeah, yeah. Effectively, you're trying to get people to be able to, especially athletes at that level, to effectively maximize as much training as they can do without blowing themselves up. In this case, an injury or otherwise, like losing motivation, overtraining syndrome, perhaps something like that. But generally speaking, the more you can train and tolerate that, that's a hedge that the more fitness adaptations and the higher your performance is likely to be, later on. And so, yeah, to your point, you and I together, we could mesh our brains together and come up with a training program that has zero injury risk. You just wouldn't train at all. You just wouldn't do anything. It wouldn't be very effective, but no injury. Yeah, we're injury free. So
yeah, that was one of the biggest discussion I had when all this mess of training load and injuries started 10 years ago. Because, for example, people are scared about fatigue and say, well, but you know that when you train someone, you actually want to induce some fatigue, otherwise you can't train. So the fact that an athlete is perceiving fatigue, for me, it's not a problem. The problem is that the fatigue is higher than what I expect or what the athlete is expecting. That's because this means that I don't have control on the process. But the kind of narrative we have created as sports scientists is that people should be scared about training, about fatigue. I mean, there is a risk when you train. There is a nice study about training load and injuries in hockey players. It was the only study that I consider well done out of 100. And this was done by Ian Schreier group in Canada. So basically, they use a method called time target trial emulation. So they try to emulate a target trial with observational data. And what they have done is interesting because they didn't only examine the increase in the risk, increase in the participation in the sport, but they also compare this increase with the increase that you would expect just because you are training more. So in other words, if you are sprinting 10 times, you have half of the risk than sprinting 20 times because you are exposed
exposure
more.
Yeah.
And this is where people got tricked by the fact that they didn't realize that the training is both the stimulus, but is also the time at risk. So the more you train, the more you are exposed at risk, but still you need to train. What they have shown is that the more you train, the more you increase the risk of injury, which is actually what we would expect, but the increase is lower than what you would expect by just increasing the time at risk.
It's like a paradox almost, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's actually, there is a protective effect. So the more you train, the less injury prone you are. Of course, since you are training more, the risk is increasing because you are just doing more. But there is a protective effect of training itself for injury. And how much you have to train someone, it's in relation to the performance. It's a risk-benefit analysis. That's it. Before an Olympic game, you can risk much more because the benefit may be higher than during the season, for example. So, yeah.
Yeah. I think people don't appreciate that because they're like, well, look, if you increase training load too rapidly, for example, for an individual to tolerate it, well, injury risk goes up a lot. That's the assumption, right? But there's little caveating around that where it's like, yeah, but their performance could also go up a bunch too, and it's probably not the potential for benefit. It's probably not proportional to the potential for injury. In fact, in this case, you would assume that the potential for benefit is actually higher than the potential for injury. And you're like, it's an optimization problem. We're walking this tightrope and trying to figure out, should we push or not? Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's why you monitor training because you have normally, I hope people, coaches have a plan in their mind. So you want to just see if the plan is going as was supposed to go. So this is why you monitor. That I don't think you can discuss monitoring without discussing also the training program. This is
Yeah.
where
Yeah. What is
yeah,
monitoring?
this is where I find myself a bit uncomfortable when also I have these kind of interviews, people asking what kind of matrix. Yeah, I don't know. What's your training? Based on the training, we can discuss what can be the best. But it's not only what is the training, what is the goal of your training.
Hmm.
Why you're jumping? Why you're doing, I don't know, power cleans? And I suppose there is a reason. So based on the reasons why you are doing that, we can decide what to monitor. But everything is around the coach, is not around the sports science department. And this
Hmm.
is actually a bit my personal and different perspective than other colleagues.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, especially if they're in the sports science department, they're like, look, hey, what are you talking about, Franco? Come on. Why are you cutting us out? And you're like, well, this is not where the decisions are necessarily made. I gave a presentation at the European Powerlifting Conference in 2019 talking about injury risk in powerlifting, right? And some
Yeah.
ways to maybe reduce that. Like, what's the lay of the land? What is the average injury risk per thousand participation hours? It's about 2 to 4, depending on the population that you look at, which is compared to other things, pretty low. And then, so, how would you manipulate this? How could you make it more risky versus less risky? And then, like, how does it interplay with performance? And at the time, one of the metrics that had been put forth to like track is this acute to chronic workload, which is probably more geared towards either team sports, endurance sports, or whatever, just because the time component is so pertinent to the mediating mechanism. And that in endurance sports, that's your volume. Basically, in team sports, it's your exposure. Not too useful for resistance training tracking because like you could be in the gym for 3 hours and only have done 15 sets, whereas that could also have been done in an hour, right? So it's not perfect there. So I'm wondering if you were trying to come up with some sort of variable to monitor with respect to injury risk in resistance training. Do you have any ideas about how you would go about monitoring that? And if you just want to throw your hands up and say, I don't know, that's totally fine too. I'm just more curious.
No, I mean, I don't know, but because w- there's no literature that can help us understanding that. I mean, I know I'm saying that, and most colleagues would probably disagree, but I can defend my position everywhere in front to everyone because show me a good study explaining what matrix we can use to monitor or yeah to control for the injury risk, and I can show you why these studies are not good enough to understand how to do that. I'm not saying that we don't have to try. It's a different.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm just saying that this idea that there are some scientific methods to control for the training load in order to limit the risk of injuries is not true. It's simply not true. Is a wishful thinking, but it's not true. There's not such a metric. There are things that we do, and if you think about it, the reason one of the reasons why the acute chronic ratio became popular is because the message is actually a message that is familiar for to coaches, like you have to avoid spikes, you have to follow progression. The first time I start to read about these ratio, I said, well, but this is actually the normal let's say training methodology. I don't see anything different. And people start to say, yeah, but now we have the proofs. And say, no, that's actually not the proof. And okay, we publish the reasons why this ratio doesn't provide the proof. But at the end of the day, the reason why people accept some metrics is because they fit with our idea of a good training.
Mhm.
I recently posted a study, one of the biggest study. There are more than 5,000 runners, and they also use the acute chronic ratio. The study is properly done because they also use a causal inference approach to understand the causal relation. long story short, their study, which is unquestionably one of the best done until now, show the opposite trend. So the higher this ratio, the lower the injury risk.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, no one advertised this study because it goes against what we normally think. Because based on the study, the faster and the more you increase, the lower is the injury risk. That it doesn't make any sense. But the methods are much stronger than the other studies showing that the spikes are dangerous. So people just pick the results that fit their idea.
That narrative.
So
Yeah.
my point was, okay, if you are just selecting the studies that fit your idea, we don't need the study. Just go on and do what you think is good, and that's it. Because if out of 100 study you pick the 30 that support your idea and you are ignoring the other 70,
Mm-hmm.
what's even the point of running all these studies? Just do it. Just do what you want, and I would be comfortable to follow. And this is what I do. Sometimes I prefer to follow these experience-based approaches than strategies based on weak evidence.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, if you're just gonna do whatever you want to do anyway, you don't need literature to support that.
Yeah.
Just like, just do it and don't tell anyone, like whatever. You don't have to explain yourself. One of the metrics we've been we're collecting data on. So we have an app, right, with tens of thousands of people that log their training in it, and been coming up with this. It's like a training impulse score. Effectively, it takes the average intensity, how many reps you did, the proximity to failure of that set, right, using RPE or with the reps in reserve anchor. And then was it a compound exercise or an isolation exercise? Because I think those two things affect people differently. And was it on a machine or was it freestanding? I don't know why I believe that a compound, freestanding exercise imparts a slightly different sort of stress to somebody than an isolation one done on a machine, but that's just my belief system. I'm open to being wrong. Anyway, and so I'm trying to figure out, is that a good proxy for like training load insofar as it would mediate the injury risk and then also people's sort of arc for strength in this case? The arc towards strength, it's pretty good. Like I'm seeing some pretty good correlation there. I like that. We haven't obviously tracked injuries in a prospective way just yet, but that's where I'm trending. But I'd be happy to not only get your thoughts on that, but also for somebody to prove me wrong and say, actually, that's all bullshit. You don't need to measure all of that stuff. Just measure this other thing. Maybe be something far more simpler. Like, hey, do you feel like an injury's coming on? The person could predict that ahead of a session. You just ask them, for example. I'd be happy if that were the case because then, hey, look, I don't have to track all this stuff. I just have to ask you before every training session, hey, how you feeling? And then I can
Yeah.
just use that,
Yeah. Well, this is actually this is the reason why I started to use RP, because in the end of the day I was thinking, okay, when you train someone as a coach and you are on the field, you try to understand how they are responding to the training. That day they are fine, you speak with the others, say, how do you feel today? And if someone is telling you, today I don't feel well, I'm not concentrated, you normally adjust the training based on this feedback. So I start to say, okay, but if we actually use this kind of feedback from the others, why don't we try to quantify a bit this kind of information so that I can use to monitor training? So that's why I found perception important. And when people told me, yeah, but this is influenced by psychological aspects, I say, yeah, that's actually why I think is important, because
It's
I
a
want to
feature.
know. Yeah,
Yeah, it's a
exactly.
feature, not a bug. Yeah.
For me, it's more dangerous that you complete some exercises when you are in a bad day, you are not very concentrated, these kind of things, because you can, that technique can be, you don't focus on the technique, and this can create problems. So these are the kind of information that I think are important. So coming back to your initial question, I think that measuring all these things may be useful to understand why something happened. You can't predict what is going to happen,
Hmm.
but if something happened, you can try to understand why. For example, I had this injury, or why the performance was so bad. And if you have different information, for example, you have these objective measures, but you also have some perception. and maybe the others told you something and you ignore, or you didn't, or you didn't focus for some reason on this kind of feedback. So you go back and you try to understand if why something happened, in order to, in the future, to avoid what you may think were mistakes. But predicting something happening in the future is the most difficult thing you can do. Even with this machine learning, all these kind of methods that we now have, most of the time the work, you create the model based on what happened in the past. And but what is going to happen in the future is something you have to test. This is called external validation. Is commonly used in clinical setting, where you have a prognostic model and you want to validate in a new population, or even in your population, but in the future. That's an important part, because it's much easier to fit a model with all data. It's much more difficult to use that model to predict what is going to happen in the future, which is what most people in reality want. But so this is the reason why I think monitoring all this information can be useful. In addition, is also to understand how athletes are coping with the training, so with the stress you have planned. That's, in my opinion, the key is always to try to understand how they are tolerating the training. And to do that, you don't need only to measure the training load, you need also to have some measure of responses. Can be measure of fatigue, or even perception, heart rate variability. It doesn't matter what you're using, but you want to understand with that specific training load, what is the response, and how is this response moving in the direction I want. So there may be a period in which you decide to intensify the training, and you know that 2 or 3 weeks of intensified training will induce fatigue. So if you start to see an increase in fatigue, that's not the problem, in my opinion, because that's actually what I wanted to do with my training. But if, for example, after a while I lower the training load and I see that fatigue is not going down, this can be a sign that something is going wrong. And so this can open to additional investigations, asking the others. Maybe sometimes you can also do some medical screening. This happened when I was working with cyclists. They were not responding well. It happened that sometimes we realized they had viral infections and these kind of things. So you see a deviation from what you plan. And this is, I think, the only reasonable thing you can do now with all these measures. I'm not saying that in the future maybe we can develop something stronger. At the moment, that I don't see this happening, even if there are a lot of wearables now, so there are a lot of informations coming. But moving from this information, from this data to real information, this is another beast.
Yeah. Ideally, you would have some objective stuff, right? These metrics, and you'd have also some subjective feedback. Again, like how are you feeling? Do you have heart rate variability? Which is an objective number, but somebody could report that. Are you sore? Do you feel like you have pain? Stuff like that. And yeah, blending those together and seeing like, well, is this the predicted response based on the change in the training, or is it, oh, this is far different than I expected? Wonder why? And then you got to dig deeper. But I don't know yet how this is all going to pan out, and if somebody else did, I wouldn't have to do this work. So we'll see what happens. With the wearables, that actually brings up a question I had for you. So many studies are using statistical associations between training load and injury risk, but inferring causality, as you'd mentioned, it's challenging to be charitable, if not inappropriate, just based on the methodology that's being used. So what's your take, on a listener they got a fitness tracker, and they get some sort of training load score, whether it's strain, for example, or some other proprietary number. Is that useful information, and should they be asking themselves or their coaches to make sure that like they're in a particular range? Like, how do you view all that stuff? Is it just noise, or just kind of like interesting information you could potentially draw a trend from? I don't know. How do you view that?
I have to be careful how I answer to this question.
We have our legal team on retainer. We're good. Don't worry about it. It's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's of course there are commercial interest behind some metrics. So it's not necessarily they can have these matrix can be solid in terms of science, and even when there are published papers, nowadays it's not enough to have something published somewhere. More or less, you can publish everything nowadays, and so you need to be, and this is complicating the area a lot. People need to be good enough to understand whether something they're reading or something that companies use to support their methods are actually solid from a scientific and robust enough from a scientific perspective, which is very, very complicated. And this is why I complain with some colleagues, because the way we communicate now science is different than 20 years ago. 20 years ago, science and the research was basically a niche area. Only researchers access this kind of information, and now this information are out there, everyone can access, can read, and you know that in any area. PubMed, they mention an article on PubMed, sometimes they mention articles on predatory journals that they don't even know is a predatory journal. So the responsibility of scientists nowadays is completely different. So when we write something, especially for example an abstract, we need to understand that people may just read the title and the abstract. Sometimes just the title. So if you use a catchy title, but the title is misleading, this is problematic because you are popularizing a concept that may be wrong. Maybe in the discussion you wrote, okay, these are the limitations, but people don't read that. So this is a responsibility we have. And even if I understand that you can have more traction on social media with some titles or strong abstract, most of the time these the results are overinterpreted or oversold. So this is one of the problems. So these matrix that are created by companies are most of the time are instrument to be competitive on the market. So this can bias, of course, everything they say about this matrix. So you can't rely on what the companies are telling you. It's like to ask to a chef if they cook well. Of course, they will tell you, yeah, I'm cooking well. So you can't rely on what they say. You have to use your intuition and your capacity to critically examine the information they are telling you. First of all, if it's too good, is unlikely true, because it's not that easy. This area is plenty of uncertainty. And the reason why some matrix or some measures got traction is because they give you what you want, and what you want is something that decreases your uncertainty, because we cope very bad with uncertainty. And after a while we create this word of the illusion of control, the illusion that we are controlling the process. No, you are not controlling the process. This is outside our reach. We can try to control the process, which is different than controlling the process. And training is plenty of external factors that can influence how things are going. So as a coach, you are controlling an aspect of the life of athletes, but they have a lot of other things going on around that you don't have. Sometimes you don't even know what is going, what they are doing when they are at home. In some team sports, professional athletes, for example, in football, coaches are monitored during training, these kind of things, but they have a personal trainer at home, and no one actually is aware of what they are doing with this personal trainer. So the monitoring that you are conducting on the field and with the club doesn't consider an important aspect of the training, which is what these athletes are doing outside the facility. So there are all these things, and after you may want to develop a prediction model to understand if the injury is, but you don't have all the information. So there are measures. I don't want to cite them, but there are measures that, in my opinion, are an absolutely bullshit. That are very commonly used, and the reason why I'm saying this is because people focus on the numbers and most of the time they miss the meaning of the numbers. I give you again the example of the acute chronic workload ratio. When they show me the IOC model with the sweet spot, all these kind of things, I was the first time I saw that model, I said, well, but based on this model, if they recover, they increase the injury risk. And this doesn't make any sense. And when I start to explain this to my colleagues, and they say, "Oh yeah, you're right." So, what I want to say is that they were focused so much on these numbers 0.3, 0.5, 1.2 that they missed the meaning of the number, because I said 0.5 means that you are training half of the accumulated average previous 4 weeks volume or whatever you're using. So basically you're recovering. So after a recovering week, you're telling me that this is dangerous because they increase the injury risk. But it doesn't make any sense. If they are tired, let's say, and they're fatigued, I give them a week of recovery with a low intensity and so on. You're telling me this is bad, this is risk. It doesn't make any sense. And when I start to mention this, people start to realize there was something wrong in this model. And this is the other point I always make also with my students. Now people are saying, because you know a bit more of statistics, so you spot some errors. And no, actually, that's absolutely not true. The statistical study was the last I did. But initially, my concerns were because just looking at the numbers and what the model was saying, there were things that didn't sound right. So I just used logic in my coaching experience, and that's why I was really disappointed with some coaches, because they said, look, you have trained Olympic athletes and you didn't realize that these concepts are unreasonable, at least. They don't make sense. So this is just to say that you can, even if you are not a scientist, but you have a critical mind, you can spot some inconsistencies in some of these metrics or in the justification. So using logic can be very helpful to spot that, or to smell that there's something wrong. And this means that you have to pick those measures with some grain of salt and not rely on them too much.
Yeah, I think as a coach, we want one of these models to be so true, because it would make our jobs so much easier. Like we have this black box of like all your tools, right? This is how I organize training. And then there's some art in applying that to the individual, but only if it was more formulaic could you be like, I feel very confident that what I'm doing is likely to work. Again, predicting the future. It's super hard, but we're like, look, I got numbers. This model works. And it's like, it actually at face value, you just look at it a little bit sideways and you're like, maybe this model's got some holes in it. Not quite there at this holy grail of like, look, you put in X, you're going to get out on Y, and that's how it goes. Unfortunately,
that's very complicated. And besides, nowadays with machine learning, artificial intelligence, LLM, all these kind of things is becoming even more complicated. But there's no. I was speaking with a friend, and he was using some methods. I said, look, they don't work. You're wasting your time. And I realized that it was too uncomfortable with this uncertainty. So at some point, we have a very good relation. So I was very direct and straight and said, look, this is the job. The coaching is plenty of uncertainty. If you cannot cope psychologically with that, maybe it's better you change job, because you have only two options. One is accept the uncertainty and you live with that, or you start to create dogmas, because dogmas are the only thing that can decrease your uncertainty and to make you more comfortable with the situation. So these are the two opposite, and of course there's maybe some gray, but people tend to polarize in these two extremes. People that accept the uncertainty and people that try to create their own world, the ideal world, where they think they have this illusion of control. They have this control, but in reality it's an illusion.
Tell you what, there's a lot of money in that dogma stuff, though. You know, like, oh, this is my proprietary method. I am certain, it's concrete, it's binary, and I'll sell it to you. If
but they do their job. They have they have a company, so I don't blame them. I mean, they are trying to sell something. Is like when you go to buy a cloth, they tell you that this is the best style
Hmm.
and whatever. They are doing their job, so it's our job. It's up to us to be strong enough to and critical enough to understand what is reasonable, what is plausible, and what is acceptable. And in the end of the day, it's always a risk benefit analysis. And whatever you do, there is a risk and there is a potential benefit. You have to balance these two. And this is very arbitrary because the same situation can be perceived in a different way. So there are risks that I'm willing to take and maybe you don't want.
Hmm.
And the other way around, there are other situations in which you think that the benefit may be much higher than the risk. But this depends on the context. So, and you were mentioning powerlifting. In these sports, you have to train smart, absolutely, but you have to train a lot. You can't train, you can't cut the training half because this is, you read a study that is showing you that you decrease the risk of injuries, overtraining, these kind of things. You can't do that. I mean,
Not
you're
gonna
not going
work.
to, yeah, it's not going to work. So
Yeah.
it's not easy, of course. It's absolutely not easy. And besides, it depends a lot on the talent you have in front of you because I train. I had the first marathon runners I trained, and they had zero experience. This runner won the marathon, and I never thought I was a good trainer. I just thought, oh, he's so strong, he's so talented that even with my shitty training, he was able to.
Yeah.
Because I
Yeah.
had to look to my train and say, yeah, that's awful. And especially recently, I had to look and say, wow, the talent of that guy was so so big that overcame all my rubbish training.
Oh yeah. No, I had a real life like run in with something like this. I put out programs for free for over a decade now, right? So if you look back 10, 15 years ago, maybe some of my first programs, it's not that they're bad. I don't know that there's a really bad program, just maybe good and less good and maybe more effective, less effective. And obviously it depends on the individual. But in any case, I've been training my ass off for a long time. And to your point earlier about being a powerlifter, yeah, you do have to train a lot. And now as a masters lifter, everyone's telling me, you got to train less. Come on, you're 40 now. You got to take it down a notch. And I'm like, look, man, I got all this training history behind me. If I train less, I'm going to get worse. I got to train more or, figure out ways to keep getting stronger. In any case, I, what I'm doing now, I believe in my heart of hearts to at least be the best training I can possibly come up with. Otherwise, I wouldn't do it. This guy, same age, been training half the time I have on one of my programs from like 15 years ago, shows up at a meet, kicks my ass. And I'm like, how does this guy, he just must be physically, mentally gifted far beyond the skills that I have to deal with my shitty training. Anyway, yeah, so it's kind of a
Yeah, I
similar thing.
mean, that's the individual response is there. Besides, the other point is that people don't understand that research normally provide you the average response in the population. They
Hmm.
don't provide you the individual responses. And you don't know exactly how people may respond. And probably you are familiar with the idea of responder and non-responder.
Hmm.
That's very tough because normally what people do is you try a training with an athlete. For some reason, they don't respond well, or you think they are not responding, and you say, "Well, it doesn't work." That's maybe not the case because there is a lot of variability in the response, even in the same individual. So normally, what I say before giving up, give another try because you
Yeah.
never know that the second time it can work, and because the way you have to read research is always in terms of average responses in the population. So if you have 10 athletes, on average, they may respond in that way, like in the study, but on average, you don't
Yeah.
know who is responding more than the others, and you have just
Yeah.
to try. And you try. The only way to try to repeat the same training more than once to be confident that it may be a non-responder.
Yeah. The analogy I use is like if you were coaching youth athletes, right? You were like their guidance counselor, for example, and they were like, "Should I play basketball?" And you're like, "Absolutely, you should try basketball." And they're like, "Should I play golf?" Absolutely, you should try golf. You should try all of these things, right? But giving up on a training program or intervention after 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks because it didn't work for you is like telling that little kid after a little brush with golf and they weren't very good at it to say, "You know what, golf's not for you." And it's like, well, look, they could come back a few months later, and maybe they're the next Tiger Woods, right? Or
Yeah.
you got was it Cameron Young or whoever, whoever. So yeah, it's the analogy holds up. I've got two questions left for you. So the first one, this is like a dystopian future. All right, little sci-fi thing for you. In a perfect world, I suppose that we'd have like known training load targets or target ranges for specific goals at sports and levels of advancement within that sport, for example. Are there any examples of like that happening right now, or maybe like training load mandates in sport? The only thing I'm familiar with, and this is not really the same, but it's like in MotoGP, for example, there's a limit on how much time you can spend practicing during the season. They're like, look, you can spend this much money, and you got this much time, this many training or practice sessions. Otherwise, the risk of them crashing their brains out and not showing up on grid gets too high. Is that sort of thing happening anywhere else in sport right now?
No, yeah, I mean, there are, yes, there are some federations that suggest, especially for academies, it's not mandatory. These are recommendations. There are some limits in the time they should be exposed, for example, to headings, because now there is this problem of concussion. So there are some rules, but these rules are more precautionary strategy. Even if there's not a lot of a solid evidence that above or below is can be dangerous, I think it's reasonable sometimes to say, okay, we don't know exactly, but let's keep it under control in some way. So it's more the kind of approach that is used with these guidelines. But yeah, there are, especially for academies and let's say for junior athletes, there are some limitations. Whether these limitations are really useful or evidence-based, I don't think so, to be honest. So it's very likely that these limits may be good for some, maybe too low for others, and too high for other athletes. But in general, it makes sense that if the dangers are not negligible, that you want to introduce some sort of control. But in the future, I mean, from a theoretical, you were talking about an hypothetical future. In everything, prediction, understanding injuries, in theory, is doable.
Yeah.
In theory, but we don't have the instrument to do that. Even with this machine learning, all these kind of things, at the moment we don't have the instrument. One problem is to have the measures that allow us to make these predictions. And by measure, I mean the measure of various factors that can influence the outcome of the process. Now there are wearables, so maybe in the future there will be some new wearables that allow to collect all this information in order to be elaborated. So in theory, this can be done. Like prediction of injuries can be done. In practice, we are not there, but we are very, very far from there. It's like personalized medicine. That's a hot topic, but I know some among the best statisticians in the world saying that it's an illusion, not because it's not doable, it's because we don't have at the moment the resources to do that.
Yes.
Because it's very, they require a lot of data, a lot of elaboration, running trials to understand the response is too big. So on paper, it's doable, but we cannot, with the resources we have, we cannot do that.
Yeah.
And I use this example because when I say Look, in medicine, they are trying to go in that direction. They are struggling and they have billions behind. In sport, that we are a niche, we are so small. Uh, it seems to me unlikely that we can do what others feel with 1,000 times our resources couldn't do. But they're trying to go there, that is using genetic markers, all these kind of things. But still, is very difficult. But I'm saying that because statisticians said it's possible, but we don't have the resources to do that at the moment.
Yeah.
So everything we said, predicting injury, understanding individual responses, all these kind of things is doable in theory, but we don't have the resources to do that. And I don't think in the next 10 or 20 years no, 20 years, I don't know, but in the next 10 years, I don't see this possible. I know this will disappoint people, especially companies, but that's,
Oh yeah.
as I told you, I'm happy to have an open conversation with anyone because in the end of the day, that's my opinion. But if you have a different opinion, and we are talking about science, we need also to show some evidence, and I don't think there are.
Yeah, I do think that all of these questions are theoretically answerable, but to your point, yeah, whether it's a technology limitation, resource limitation, both, or just we don't even know what to measure. Like there are multiple gaps in what we know right now that would limit that. But I'm just thinking, like, all right, what is 20 years, 50 years, 100 years from now? Little Timmy wants to go out for football or whatever. You put him on a conveyor belt, they swab the inside of his cheek, and they do a pan scan of him, and they're like, this guy needs X for his training load, based on what we know now. That would be cool. I think that would
Yeah,
be cool.
that would
Uh,
be cool, but there will be no coach anymore because you can do
yeah.
it with an algorithm. You don't
Well,
need anyone.
and perhaps in this dystopian future, everybody ends up being the same level of good at their sport, right? And then there are no winners and losers anymore. It's all draws, and then yeah, then we're really in a pickle. But yeah,
Yeah.
just the thought. Okay, this is the last question, and I know this is a recent paper. It doesn't directly have to do with measuring training load, or but maybe a more practical example. The recent review, I think it's from last year, was on skill acquisition in sport. And for listeners who haven't read this paper, I put in the show notes. A good chunk of the papers were on golf. As a golfer, I liked that. But the majority of studies were in inexperienced athletes, inexperienced subjects, and there was only like short-term follow-up for most of them, so a little less excited about that. But limitations to the methodology and the inclusion of the included subjects aside, how does the concept of training load intersect with or inform the process of like acquiring and mastering sports-related skills?
That's actually, there is a good friend of mine, his name is Job Franzen, who's an expert in skill acquisition, and he is also very critical about the area. I mean, he has a very critical approach. There are different theories about the volume of practice that you need to master something, with some thinking that the more you do, the better, and some thinking that's not necessarily true. I don't think I see both points. I think there are sports in which practice is important, and the more you do, the better. I have no doubts about that.
Mm.
Golf may be one of these, to be
Yeah,
honest.
super high skill or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And but from a monitoring perspective, we come back as before. We don't know how much is enough for each individual.
Mm.
So the only thing you can do is to monitor the practice based on what is your philosophy of coaching or what you think is useful. But from that, I'm very. I think quality is important, but I still think that quantity has an important role in any sport. Now people move towards doing less and better, but it depends less than what. Because if it's less than, let's say, moderate volume of training, I don't think this is going to work. But less is better if the quality and is good, because if you are a high level athlete, you are already training a lot. So in that situation, even increasing just a bit may be the thing that induce overtraining, overreaching, or all these kind of things. So when you are at that level, training a bit less and with better quality, or optimizing what you're doing, actually can make the difference. But at that level, but I think at that level are very few athletes are at that level. Most of the athletes are, even good athletes, are still in an area where quantity quantity matters. It's not the same thing. It's like when we discuss about injury prevention, improving strength in different populations. Yeah, improving strength, I'm sure it can be helpful for several reasons, but improving strength in someone that is already strong is different than improving strength in someone that is, let's say, weak. So
Can
the
confirm.
fact, yeah, first of all, it's much more difficult to improve strength in someone who is already strong, and second, the effects may be different, at least in terms of magnitude. So when we generalize finding from the studies, we need also to think about the population. Besides, I'm not saying that you cannot apply studies in other population, in your population, but the entity of the changes may be much different. So you can maybe have improvement that are negligible, or you cannot even measure this improvement in some populations.
Yeah.
So, but for in general, from a skill acquisition perspective, I still think that the quantity is important. Also because the quality is a very weird concept. It's not easy to understand because quality movements means to have a standard, while there may be a lot of individual differences depending on the individual characteristics. So it's much more difficult to understand to have a reference standard for technique or whatever.
Yeah. Well, people say that all the time. They're like, well, look, perfect practice makes perfect. And so, for example, in powerlifting, which is we charitably call it a sport, and I happen to participate in that activity, they're like, well, look, you got to have perfect squat form and technique. And I'm like, well, what is that? I mean, based on the sport, there are some constraints to the squat. For example, the bar has to be on your back. You have to get below parallel, and you have to start from a locked out position, right? And then rack it under your own power. But there are many variations within that. And further, if you're saying, well, I'm not talking about that, I'm just saying in your training, you have to squat what's perfect for you. And I'm like, well, what if I happen to get out of position on the platform? Isn't it nice to have some additional strategies to try to overcome the load so I make the lift? There's, to your point, there's probably some benefit to like just getting exposed more and more often, so you have you're practicing, right? But it doesn't have to be this rigid model of like only this way can you practice. I think that's yeah.
That's actually a very good example, because powerlifting, weightlifting is where I see a lot of a bit of a mess. Meaning that no, because I have actually very good friends who are coaches and also were international athletes, and if you speak with them or you speak with other, say, coaches at lower level, these are the one at higher level are the ones that are more aware about individual differences. They don't have the fixation with the perfect technique, so they allow for some, let's say, individual adjustments much more than the lower level coaches and athletes. And I agree with them, because at the end of the day, you may have an idea of technique, but this can be adjusted by the different individual that they tend to adapt to their characteristics. While when you speak with others, I have seen videos of world champions and posted on social media, and tons of comments about the bad technique, all these kind of things. I say, what the fuck? I mean, if, if, if this person won the world championship, they won. It's effective because they yeah, but
By
it can be
definition.
better. So yeah, it can be better, but still is one of the best in the world. So eventually this technique is good for the performance, because in the end of the day, what people don't understand is that powerlifting, weightlifting is a performance-based sport. So in the end of the day, what matters is how much load you lift. That's so the more the better. So any strategy that allow these athletes to lift more than others allow them to win or to compete at a high level. So that's they are not evaluated based on the technique. It's not the gymnastic, with the uh,
Yeah.
referees saying, "Oh, this is good, this is bad." In the end of the day, and this is why I like, because it's a very pragmatic sport. I mean,
Yep.
they have to lift as much as they can, and actually, in theory, they can use, okay, within some constraint, other variations, any variations of technique. So it's okay. But this is the fixation with these, small changes. The debate about the Chinese and the technique of the Chinese. Well, another point, and I don't want to take too much time, but something people don't understand is that elite sport, we are working with the survivors.
Oh yeah.
So the survival bias is very important, and you find this problem a lot also in studies. When you compare elite athletes with other people, you basically are comparing orange with apples, because they are a selection. So you don't know if they are using a technique that is good for them. You cannot generalize to other individuals, because the one that you see at the top of the pyramid are the one that survive over the
Hmm.
years. So it's possible that the technique they are using have destroyed thousands of other people, and they are the only one that can cope with that specific technique that allow them to live more than others. So these kind of comparisons are very difficult to do, and I normally warn people, don't compare elite with others, because the elite are a very selected population,
Yep.
and it's very likely that they are the survivor of also bad techniques.
Hey, yeah, present company included. Because people they do ask, they're like, "Hey, look, should I just do your program? Why don't you just publish the program you're running? I'll buy it so I can run it." And I'm like, financial motivations aside, I'm not sure that what I'm doing is going to work for you. And then the reason why I've been able to persist so long in this sport and achieve some modicum of success is probably, related to unique things that make me me. And if you don't have those same unique characteristics, I would just be setting you up for failure. And I can't abide that. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's like the other people that I've been competing with for these 15 years, we are far different than the people who started competing. They did it for 2 years and then burnt out. And so if I was creating my prototypical power lifter who's going to go be a world beater and persist at the top of the sport for years, yep, they'd respond awesome to resistance training. They'd gain a lot of muscle mass and a lot of strength. Yep, they'd have a really robust musculoskeletal system to start with, thick joints, everything else. And they'd have a great work ethic, and they'd also be super resistant to injury because, like, you need all of those things to survive. And it's like the strongest potential powerlifter ever, probably, it's going to be some mix of that. But there's somebody who maybe is potentially their max volitional isometric contractile force is higher, but they can't sustain the training, and so they can't ever, sustain that and be at the top of
Yeah.
sport. But
Yeah. I completely agree. But training load money, all these kind of things, should be seen from this perspective. So in the context of uncertainty, individual responses, all these kind of things. So the only thing you can do is to monitor training, just to understand whether your program is going in the direction that you plan.
mm-hmm.
And that's why what you measure depends on your training program. There's not such a goal measure. It's up to you, and people don't accept that. They
No.
want to find the best measure, and every time they ask me what do I use, I don't know what you can use. I mean, there are tons of measures. Some are good, some are less, maybe not that good, but it really depends. If you have designed your training based on time, you measure time. If we Because there are two different kind of discussions. One is about how we monitor training, and the other is how we plan a training. So if I agree with the training, because when I work with teams, and sometimes I provide what I think is better to monitor what they are doing, it doesn't mean that I agree with what they are doing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'm just saying, okay, if you want to do that, it's your job. You are paid for that. You are fired if you fail. So my job is to help you in doing what you want to do without questioning anything. If you ask me an opinion, I can provide my opinion, what I would do or why I don't agree. But in the end of the day, it's a coach decision. So to summarize, I trust coaches, and I work around coaches. They are the one training athletes. And
Hmm.
if as a sports scientist, I need to help you. uh, the level of help depends on what kind of help you want from me. If it's just monitoring or you want to discuss about the strategy, you may say, I'm doing this because of these reasons. I can say, okay, these reasons make sense. These are actually not really supported by evidence. So maybe it works, but not for that reason, for example.
Hmm.
And besides, I much prefer a very elaborated and solid reasoning than the use of weak evidence. So
Yeah.
that's always my where I separate from a practical perspective the people I trust and the people I don't trust in terms of coaching.
I was gonna ask you what's the one thing you want people to take away from this, and you just did it. You're a natural. Like if you don't have a podcast yet, maybe consider one. Just with all the extra time that you have.
As I
So
told you, I'm a boomer for these things, and I have this setup because the manipulation of my sons to buy them all the equipment. But yeah, no, I know that most of the time people don't have from me the answers they want, and I can't give the answer they want. I'm sorry.
yeah, I was
I
hoping you were gonna tell me how to get stronger, but turns out we just I know less now than I started. So
yeah, I mean, you, I can tell you have to train more.
yeah, hey, I like that. I'm here for that. I'm here for that. As long as I get
If
to
you
lift
can
more.
train more and you survive, you may be stronger. Yeah,
Truer
that's
words
that.
never spoken. I like that. Where can people find you? I know, like, I'm gonna list. There's a Google Scholar page with all of your publications, so I'll link that. Is there any way for people to interface with you on social media? Are you a
Yeah,
lurker? Do you post? What do you do?
I'm in social media. I'm on X. I'm on Blue Sky. I'm in all social media. But in the last years, I move a bit away from social media. um, I read posts. I lurk posts. I don't interact as much as in the past because I'm quite. I'm Italian, so sometimes I cannot control myself. So I decide to to move a bit away, and a joke apart, also because I found recently it was a bit too toxic as an environment. So I read it just to have an idea what is happening, but I find more and more difficult to interact because I'm very critical, but I like to have this kind of conversation, to have an intellectual opponents. Most of my co-authors and my colleagues are intellectual opponents, um, but this kind of interaction is becoming more and more difficult, and people get offended very easily. Um, just to say, I'm on social media. I don't interact a lot, but I read um,
All right.
comments and posts and these kind of things.
Well, if you're out there and you're commenting on training load, just know that Dr. Impellizzeri he's reading your stuff. He's kind of like Santa Claus. He sees you, when you've been naughty, he sees when you've been nice. Yeah, I'll link all of his stuff in the show notes. But really, thank you so much
Now,
for
thank
joining
you
me.
for
It's been a
having
pleasure.
and for the invitation. Thank you very much.